Leonard Lake and Charles Ung, the serial killers of the Sierra Nevada. Leonard Lake and Charles Ung were a pair of American serial killers responsible for the murders of at least 11 people during the mid-1980s. The duo gained infamy for their disturbing Operation Miranda, a plan inspired by the novel The Collector by John Fowles, in which they sought to kidnap, torture, and enslave young women. Their crimes, which involved kidnapping, sexual assault, torture, and murder, took place at a remote cabin in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. The pair's meticulous planning, brutal methods, and obsession with torture and domination made them two of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Leonard Lake, early life and descent into crime. Leonard Thomas Lake was born on October 29, 1945, in San Francisco, California. His childhood was troubled, marked by his parents' separation when he was young. He was raised primarily by his grandmother, who reportedly encouraged his early fixation on pornography. As a teenager, Lake began developing violent sexual fantasies, particularly fantasies about keeping women as sex slaves. Lake served in the U.S. Marine Corps during the Vietnam War and was honorably discharged. After leaving the military, he lived a largely transient lifestyle, moving between jobs and relationships. He married briefly, but the marriage ended due to his increasingly bizarre and controlling behavior. Lake's obsession with survivalism and his violent fantasies grew over time, and he began preparing for what he believed would be an impending global catastrophe. Lake's criminal activities started small, with minor thefts and scams, but they escalated when he met Charles Ung in the early 1980s. Charles Ung, early life and military background. Charles Chitat Ung was born on December 24, 1960, in Hong Kong. Ung was a troubled child who often clashed with his strict father, leading to his rebellious behavior. As a teenager, he moved to the United States to attend a private school, but he was expelled for stealing and other criminal activities. In 1979, Ung enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps using false documents. However, his military career was short-lived. He was arrested for stealing weapons and went to military prison. Ung was released after serving time, but his criminal tendencies persisted. After his release, he met Leonard Lake, and the two formed a deadly partnership. The deadly duo and Operation Miranda. In the early 1980s, Lake and Ung began working together on Lake's twisted plan, which he called Operation Miranda. The plan was named after the character Miranda in John Fowles' novel The Collector, which tells the story of a man who kidnaps a woman and holds her captive as his personal prisoner. Lake and Ung decided to act out this fantasy, building a bunker on Lake's remote property in Wilseyville, located in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California. The bunker was designed to hold kidnapped women, where they could be tortured, sexually assaulted, and eventually murdered. Lake was the mastermind behind the operation, while Ung, who shared Lake's sadistic tendencies, acted as his accomplice. Between 1983 and 1985, Lake and Ung carried out a series of brutal kidnappings and murders, targeting both men and women. While the men were often killed quickly, the women were kept alive for extended periods, during which they were sexually assaulted and tortured. The duo recorded some of their actions on video, capturing their victims' terror and their own depravity. The victims. While Lake and Ung are believed to have murdered at least 11 people, some estimates suggest that their victim count could be as high as 25. Their victims included neighbors, friends, and entire families. Kathleen Allen, one of the most well-known victims. Kathleen Allen was lured to the cabin under the pretense that her boyfriend had been injured. She was held captive, tortured, and murdered by Lake and Ung. Brenda O'Connor, Lonnie Bond Sr., and their infant son. The family lived next to Lake and Ung, and when O'Connor became suspicious of their activities, they were kidnapped and killed. Lake and Ung murdered the infant as well. Randy Johnson and Harvey Dubbs, they were among the other victims who had the misfortune of crossing paths with the killers. Many of their bodies were dismembered and buried on Lake's property. The victims were often lured to the cabin under false pretenses, such as promises of work or friendship, before they were trapped, tortured, and killed. The bunker and the crimes. The bunker that Lake and Ung built on the Wilseyville property was a small, fortified structure designed to hold captives. It contained a reinforced cell, where they would imprison their victims. The room was soundproofed and contained only the most basic of necessities, giving Lake and Ung full control over their captives. Lake kept extensive diaries and videotapes detailing his fantasies and actions. These recordings, some of which survived, depicted the horrific torture and abuse inflicted on the women. Lake's writings revealed his belief that he could train women to be submissive sex slaves, and he showed no remorse for his crimes. Capture and arrest. The capture of Leonard Lake and Charles Ung was almost accidental. On June 2, 1985, Ung was caught shoplifting from a hardware store in South San Francisco. When store employees attempted to stop him, Lake, who was with Ung, intervened and fled the scene. Ung also managed to escape, but left behind the stolen goods, including a gun with a silencer. Police were called, and when they traced the vehicle the men had driven to the store, they found that it was registered to a man who had been reported missing. Lake was later caught and taken into custody. When police searched the car, they found evidence linking him to several disappearances, including a bullet casing that matched a murder. Rather than face the consequences of his crimes, Lake swallowed cyanide pills that he had hidden in his clothing and died in police custody. The investigation and the horrifying discoveries after Lake's death, investigators searched his property in Wilseyville. What they found was beyond horrifying. Police discovered human remains, including bones and teeth, as well as personal belongings of several missing people. The bunker, along with the videotapes and Lake's diaries, provided chilling evidence of the murders. The tapes showed Lake and Ung tormenting their victims, and the diaries documented Lake's twisted fantasies and justification for the killings. Despite Lake's death, the investigation into the murders continued, and the search for Ung intensified. Charles Ung's capture and trial. Charles Ung fled to Canada after Lake's death and managed to avoid capture for nearly a month. In July 1985, he was finally arrested in Calgary, Alberta, for attempting to shoplift from a store. His arrest led to a lengthy legal battle between the US and Canadian governments over his extradition, as Ung faced the death penalty in California, and Canada did not have capital punishment. Ung was eventually extradited to the United States in 1991, and his trial began in 1998. The evidence against him was overwhelming, thanks to the videotapes, Lake's diaries, and the testimony of survivors. Ung attempted to shift the blame entirely onto Lake, claiming that he had only been a bystander to the murders. However, the jury was unconvinced. In 1999, Charles Ung was convicted of 11 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He remains on death row in San Quentin State Prison as of 2024, awaiting execution. Legacy and psychological insights. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ung remains one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in American history. The brutality of their crimes, combined with the chilling calmness with which they carried them out, shocked the nation. Lake's obsession with control, power, and sexual domination, coupled with Ung's willingness to participate in their horrific acts, created a deadly partnership. Psychologists have speculated that Lake's early exposure to pornography, and his experiences in the military contributed to his desire to dominate and control others. Ung, on the other hand, exhibited antisocial behavior and a lack of empathy from a young age, making him a willing accomplice in Lake's sadistic plans. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, and it continues to haunt those who study the darker aspects of human nature.